So, good morning everyone. So, today I am here with English class number 13, and today hopefully let's finish the discussion on the question and answers relating to the poem by Khalil Gibran titled as On Children. So, in the last class we have discussed about what the poet Khalil Gibran wants to tell us about a poem called On Children. So, when you actually look into the poem, you will come to know very clearly that what kind of a narration is going on in the poem, and then whom does the prophet, that is the speaker in the poem, is talking to, and how does he want, or what does his philosophy in terms of children and parents are being told in the poem prescribed, isn't it? So, we have very clearly discussed about certain things that were related to On Children. So, I had told you about the title here, On Children, and we have been given here about the roles and responsibilities of a children on one hand, and you have been given about the roles and responsibilities of the parents on children on the other hand. Okay. So, the very easiest way to understand this poem is nothing but you have expectation in the middle, and on the one side you have children, and on the other hand you have the parents. So, what exactly do they expect from the children, from the parents? This is how you need to understand. So, if you have to understand this poem, just take it into consideration that there are expectations. On one hand, there are children who wants to expect something from the parents. On the other hand, you have parents who have to expect something from their children. So, here the poet Khalil Gibran has very clearly told us about how children should be and what parents should do as their parents in order to upbring their children for the future, isn't it? So, how did the poem start? The poem actually starts with a conjunction and, isn't it? So, there is a woman who is holding a baby in her against her bosom, and then she is talking to someone, or she is telling someone to speak to us of children. So, this is the very first line of the poem, and the moment she tells a person to speak to us of children, the prophet. Okay. So, remember, the prophet or the speaker in the poem starts telling us about the children, isn't it? So, if you go through the poem, you will know like how exactly or what does he wants to say about the children, isn't it? You can give them the thoughts, you can give them the love, but not the thoughts. One line, if I have to remember, maybe I can just say that. In the similar way, there are so many certain things which the poet is telling on children. At the same time, he is also telling it to the parents as well. So, when you come to the last part of the poem, you will also come to know the expectations in terms of children from their parents and the expectations from parents on their children. So, that is why it is been titled as On Children there. Okay. So, when we are talking about the comparison that the poet makes in the poem, okay, the very nice personifications or some of the certain figures of speech that the poet uses here is that, comparing the bow to the parents and the live arrows to the children, isn't it? So, according to the poet, he has compared that both bow as well as arrows are necessary in life, where who is the person one who can have a hold on both bows as well as on the arrows? Obviously, it is the creator, or it is the God. So, please go through the poem once again and then probably understand what all the things that he wants to tell us in the form of reflections, in the form of comparisons, in the form of the description about the poem on children here. So, what I presumably hope that you have understood the poem with all the discussions that we had in the last class, and now let me take you into the comprehension part of the poem, and then I will wind up this session. Okay. So, when you go to the comprehension, it is as usual with the other things that we have done. It is nothing but you will have the comprehension. Okay. So, the comprehension one, question number 1 on page number 18 of your text. Okay, so you can just mark these one word answers there only, and then second and third we will have a discussion and then we will wind it up. Clear? Okay. Now, and a woman who held a babe against her bosom said, "Speak to us of children." And he said, here he refers to. This is the very first line of the poem, if you can note it, right? So, and a woman who held a babe against her bosom said, "Speak to us of children." And he said, here he refers to the prophet. Okay, don't have a confusion by saying that it is her child or the poet or something. You can say either the speaker or the prophet itself is a precise answer that is given already in the option. So, hence you will definitely write it as, or you will tick a mark on the prophet. So, the woman is talking to the prophet. So, obviously he refers to the prophet here. Clear? Right. Then, your children are not your children means. Okay, in the form of the discussion when we had, your children are not your children. Who has said this line? This line is spoken or told by the prophet, isn't it? So, what does it mean? You have been given three options there and you got to tick the correct one. Like, they do not belong to their parents only. The children should have their own space, or parents should not be possessive of their children. Which one do you think is the best suiting option for this question? Line is, your children are not your children. The first option is, they just don't belong to the parents only. The second option is, they should have their own space, or parents should not be possessive of their children. I think if you consider all these three options, the best suiting option would be the option C, isn't it? That is, parents should not be possessive about their children. They shouldn't be too possessive about their children, because the whole idea of the poem is to give enough freedom to the children in terms of their life that they have to prepare for the future, isn't it? So, option C would be the correct suitable answer to this question. Then, they come through you but are not from you means. So, this is also a line again spoken by the prophet himself, and they come through you. That is, the children come through their parents but are not from you means, though parents give birth to their children, they do not own them, OWN, okay, they do not own them. Children should have independent personalities, or parents should be indifferent to their children. So, when you look into these three options here, probably you might feel here and there about choosing a correct option. See, the very first option says is that, though parents give birth to their children, they do not own them. Somewhere probably this might be an option or something, maybe your mind says. Children have independent personalities, or parents should be indifferent to their children. So, straight away option C can be omitted here, but you will have to understand, or you will have to choose an option between A and B, in which option A says that you cannot own them. That is, though they come from you, though the parents give birth, but they do not have a kind of an owning, like, what can I say, you cannot be once again possessive. We discussed in the last question. In the similar way, even you should give option to, children have independent personalities. Okay, that would be the correct option. Why? Because children are born, or they have come to the earth through their parents, but they should be given what? Freedom, isn't it? That's the reason that you will have to say that all children who come through their parents should have independent personalities. So, option B would be the correct answer to this question. Clear? Okay. Now, let's come to the next one. According to the prophet, what may be given to the children? As a parent, what can you give to the children? You can just give love, isn't it? It's very clearly told in one of the lines in the poem that you can give them your love but not your thoughts. So, you can say love or affection. This can be the answer to this question. Hope you are following it. All right. Their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow means. Whose souls do you think the poet is talking to us here about? He is talking to us about the children. So, the children's soul dwell where they rest, or where they think, where they confront, where they think in their future term, isn't it? So, they dwell in the house of tomorrow means children belong to the future. Parents cannot shape their children's future, or children have a different vision of life. So, when you look into these three options that have been given here, your mind should definitely think of, like, they dwell in the house of tomorrow is an indirect proportion to their future life. So, what could be the answer? Yes? Yeah. Children belong to the future. So, that will be your answer. Children belong to the future. Then, the bows and the living arrows refer to dash and dash. I hope you know the answer to this question. The bows reference to the parents. A bow is a reference to a parent, and the arrows or the living arrows refer to the children, according to Khalil Gibran, or according to the poet, according to the prophet. You can say anything. So, bows, direct comparison to the parents, and the living arrows, a comparison made to the children. Then, for even as he loves the arrow that flies, and he loves also the bow that is stable. Stable, ideal, something that doesn't move at all. Okay, stable. Discuss the contrast between the underlined phrases. You will have to just discuss the contrast. Contrast means the difference between these two phrases, that is arrow that flies and bow that is stable. Okay, so do you play that archer game? Downloading it from the Play Store, or maybe on your smartphones or something. So, what exactly do you do there? So, there is a man, one who keeps on holding a bow and then keeps on rotating. There is a target, isn't it? So, I am just giving an example so that you can understand it in a better way. So, he is asking us to give the difference between the two phrases that are underlined in this question. So, obviously, arrow that flies is nothing but it is something that is there always with a movement. Obviously, a reference to children, isn't it? On the other hand, the bow that is stable. So, he is telling us about the interdependency between the parents as well as the children here. So, the arrow that flies is something reference to the children because they keep on moving. They keep on moving. On the other hand, Creator or the God, he doesn't only love the arrows, but also he loves the bow that is stable. So, bow is a reference to the father or the mother, so to say the parents, right. So, bow that is stable. Discuss the contrast. So, arrow that flies is nothing but movement, and the bow that is stable means because of if there is no bow, there is no use of the arrows, isn't it? Bow is always something which is stable, which can provide them the food, shelter, or whatever the basic necessities of a life which is being provided to the children by their parents, isn't it? So, it is always stable. But on the other hand, an arrow is something that keeps on moving or flying further and further in order to reach up to the success in their life, which is being told by the poet here. So, with this I come to the end of this comprehension 1 question numbers. I think we had discussed so far around 7 questions on the comprehension with 1 mark each or something, where 7th question you will have to just think a lot and think more and then write it in terms of if it is asked. Okay. So, comparison is one thing, and then what are the things that the poet has asked us to understand through the poem has been discussed here. Alright. So, now let me come on to the comprehension 2 question. Comprehension 2 is nothing but for your 4 marks for your preparation, and this is nothing but the short answers here. The very first question that is been asked here is that why does the prophet categorically state your children are not your children? In order to answer this question, you should understand category. He says it with a categorically, isn't it? What do you mean by categorically? It is something which has to be understood in the daily life, isn't it? You need to understand all those things in terms of categorizing between children and the parents. Okay, so the two categories are being made, and you will have to write, your children are not your children. Means to say that children do come on the earth through their parents, but they belong to the Creator Himself. So that is why He makes two categories: parents, children, and then He says that your children are not your children, but they belong to the Creator. Through Him or through their parents, they are here, and you just look after their comforts in terms of the life that they wish to lead. Probably in this way you can just think of certain points and then add up your answer to make it into 80 to 100 words or so. All right, then what does the metaphor bows and arrows signify with regard to parent-children relationship? Okay, he has personified it, he has also said it, or he has also used the bows and arrow concept as a metaphor. And what we have to see here is that when he talks to us something about a metaphor, it is nothing but making a comparison to the lively things that are around us. So what are those lively things that are around us with a reference to bow and arrow? A bow is a reference to the parent, and arrow is a reference to the child or to the children. So you just got to link that and use this. How exactly has he used the metaphor bows and arrows signify with regard to parent-children relationship? You can take that metaphor and change it, or maybe reference to parent and children with the present world. How exactly you can just make it. That's what you will have to write. Then, according to the prophet, what attitude should parents have towards their children? So, when the prophet starts speaking about the children, he speaks to the, when we read the poem, actually you come to know, or you will come to understand that the first thing that he speaks to us about the children is on children, and the later part he shifts to the parents, and at last he talks to us about the Creator. So there are three things that he talks to us about. First he talks to the children or tells us about the children, then he talks about the parents, and then he talks about the Creator. So here you have a question: according to the prophet, what attitude should parents have towards their children? So you will be just going to take all the details from what prophet has told about the children. That is the very first half of the poem. You will have to consider all those things, and then you will have to write the answer. Clear? Like you can give them love but not your thoughts. So there are certain lines that he comes in the first half of the poem. You will have to consider all those details, and you will have to write the answer to that. Clear? Okay. So you had only 3 questions on comprehension 3 here, and then let us come on to the comprehension 3 of the poem. Look at this. In this poem, parents could stand as a metaphor for the older generation, or the leaders, or the religious heads, or the teachers. What do you think? Comprehension question. This is not something that, have you considered the above options offer different readings of the poem? Okay. So you have been given 4 options to consider this poem. If you consider each one of the options that have been given, how would be your reading? So this question is not for writing purpose, it is only to understand and comprehend. I'll just do one for an example. Probably in that way you can do the other 3 options that are given. For example, in this poem, parents could stand as a metaphor. Both parents as well as the children, both are being used as the metaphors there, isn't it? So parents could stand as a metaphor for the older generation. If you think for the older generation, they have their narrow-mindedness towards upbringing their children, isn't it? The one example that I could give you here is that, like, if there was an older generation who wants to bring up his or her child or a children, what do you think he would have thought of? I am a farmer, you should also become a farmer. Or I am someone else and I want you to become, or I want you to become, or I want you to follow the same footsteps of what I had followed, because I have followed what your grandfather was. Getting? So, there are 4 options given here. If the poem could be read under readers, how would you react? I am sorry, leaders, how would you react? And if it is read from the perspective of being spiritual or religious heads, how would you comprehend? Well, if the poem is read with the perception of being a teacher, how would you comprehend it? Okay, so don't worry about that particular question, but see to it that how differently can you read and imbibe or comprehend with your understanding of the poem. Okay, there are 4 options that were given there. Older generation, you had a leader, and then you had a religious head, or maybe a teacher or so. So you can read, of course, with the 4 ways that have been told in the poem, right? Then second question, in the light of the poem, think of different levels of freedom children must have in shaping their lives. I'll read the question again. In the light of the poem, whatever you have studied, comprehended, think of different levels of freedom. Think of different levels of freedom children must have shaping their lives. So, what is that you are going to consider here? You are going to consider only again the first half of the poem only, isn't it? Where the prophet is asking the parents to give them enough freedom in terms of what do they expect from their parents. Okay, so the very first half of the poem, all those lines which have been already comprehended, that can be the answer until he talks to us about the parents. Okay, don't come on to that bow and arrow example or a metaphor that is being used here. Until then, you have to talk about what kind of the freedoms does the prophet talks to us about with respect to the shaping the lives of their own children. That is what you got to read there. Coming on to the last question, and the last question is something on the poem does not focus merely on the lives of children, but also talks about the responsibility of parents. Discuss. I think I don't need to understand, I don't need to discuss, or I don't need to explain to you here about the roles of the different 2 people or the persons that have been used here in the poem. Okay, so don't ever forget that when the prophet is talking to us, he talks to us about categories. He talks to us about the children, he talks to us about the parents, then he talks to us about the creator. Isn't it? When he sums up the poem, he regards or he concludes or he takes into consideration both the views of the children as well as the views of the parents. So, and then he sums up by saying that God or the creator is not the one who loves only those living or flying arrows, but he also loves the bow that is stable. You are not going to read or write until then, but you are just going to talk some certain things relating to their children, what do they expect, and you just need to do, being a parent, what you are supposed to do or something. Okay, so discuss only in terms of the parents as well as the children on one hand. If you do that, you will come to know about the important aspects of one thing that will has to happen while following it up with a poem like on children. So, with this I have discussed, or I have completed my discussion on the comprehension, all 3, 1, 2 and 3 questions that we had, and you have been left out with your way of reading certain questions that have been given there. Okay, and then there are suggested reading, some 4 texts have been given, and one more very important aspect that that is awaiting for you is on the next page. Obviously, what is it? What is there in the next page of your question? I mean, sorry, the textbook. The next page of your textbook actually has a translated version of the same poem in your regional language. Can you see? Go on to page number 20 and you will find out that the same poem that you have already studied or discussed has been translated into Kannada, and you have that thing to understand. So what I request you is that, like, you know, so after having all the discussions of the poem or so, and discussing even the question and answers, probably if you read that Kannada translated version of the poem, probably you may understand it in some more better ways, what I feel. So on page 20 you have been given the translated version of the same poem into your own regional language, and it has been done by Dr. Prabhu Shankara. Maybe you can just have a look at it, you can read it again and then go to the original version of the English version of the poem, and then just try to compare it and then understand what exactly both the things go on par with the same kind of a comprehension that we have done it or something. So with this, I just conclude this session on children, and so far we have done 3 units from your springs, isn't it? So we have done 3 units from your springs, and probably in the next class let us do another essay, something that is related to environment. That I would be starting in my next session, and I positively presume and hope that whatever is being taught through online on all these days with your 3 units, with respect to the 3 units that have been done, you have understood it very quite well. And yeah, my responsibility is right now here is to provide you the notes of those comprehension 2 and 3 questions, which I will be doing it once you are into the, once you are in the college. And yeah, so it's a kind of a non-interactive class that we have been going on with. So let's possibly hope that you will be back to the college very soon, and we will have this interactive class rather than this one mode or one way of speaking. So thank you very much, and I shall meet you in my next class with an essay by Vandana Shiva, that is the 4th unit.